Erwin Rommel. On the morning of October 14th, 1944, two generals from Hitler's headquarters arrived at the home of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel in the German village of Herrlingen. Rommel was recovering from a fractured skull sustained 3 months earlier when a British aircraft strafed his car in France. He was 52 years old, still in bed most days. When the visitors arrived, the generals laid out 3 options. Rommel could travel to Berlin and defend himself before Hitler. He could stand trial before the People's Court, which was functionally a death sentence that would bring disgrace and punishment down on his entire family. Or he could take the cyanide capsule that one of the generals had carried from Berlin in his coat pocket. If he chose the capsule, his family would be protected, he would receive a full state funeral, and his death would be publicly announced as the result of his earlier war wounds. He had been loosely implicated in the July 20th assassination plot against Hitler through testimony extracted under torture. Rommel went inside and told his wife and his 15-year-old son Manfred what had been offered. He said he had chosen the capsule and had 15 minutes. He put on his Afrika Korps jacket, took his field marshal's baton, and got into the car. The car drove into a wooded area outside the village and stopped. Within minutes, Rommel was dead. A doctor was brought to the scene and forced at gunpoint to certify the cause of death as a heart attack. That evening, German radio announced that the Desert Fox had died of his wounds. Hitler ordered a national day of mourning. The truth did not come out until after the war ended. Georgy Zhukov. On June 18th, 1974, 77-year-old Georgy Zhukov died in Moscow from a stroke. He had spent his final years in isolation, largely erased from official Soviet history. The general who organized the defense of Moscow, planned the encirclement at Stalingrad, and personally commanded the final assault on Berlin in April 1945 ended his life, writing his memoirs in a quiet apartment while the government decided which parts of his story the public would be permitted to read. Zhukov had been born a peasant and risen to become the most important Soviet military commander of the Second World War. He received 4 Hero of the Soviet Union awards. He was the man Stalin called when the situation was desperate, which was often. But after the war, that same fame became a liability. Stalin stripped him of his positions in 1946 and exiled him to minor regional commands. After Stalin's death, Zhukov returned briefly to power as defense minister in 1955. Then Khrushchev, who had relied on his support to hold power, turned on him in 1957 and removed him permanently. Zhukov spent his remaining years writing. The Soviet government allowed his memoirs to be published only after removing all criticism of Stalin and inserting a fictional episode crediting Khrushchev with a wartime advisory role. Zhukov signed off on the censored version because he had no other option. His body was cremated, contrary to his own wish for a Christian burial. His ashes were placed in the Kremlin wall. The man who arguably saved the Soviet Union from destruction was not permitted to choose where he was buried. Audie Murphy. On May 28, 1971, 45-year-old Audie Murphy boarded a small twin-engine plane in Atlanta, Georgia, bound for Martinsville, Virginia, on a business trip. The pilot had no instrument rating and had logged only 6 hours in that specific aircraft. By the time the plane reached the mountains of Virginia, visibility near the ridgelines was near zero, with fog and rain sitting on the terrain. Murphy was the most decorated American combat soldier of the Second World War. At 19 years old in France, he had mounted a burning tank destroyer and held off an entire company of German soldiers alone for over an hour while wounded. He received the Medal of Honor for that action, and nearly every other combat decoration the United States Army could award. By 1971, he was struggling financially and had taken on investment work that required travel. The plane never filed a flight plan. When it failed to arrive, no one reported it missing for nearly 2 days. Witnesses on the ground had seen the aircraft flying dangerously low, in and out of clouds, at one point appearing to attempt a landing on a highway. The plane struck Brush Mountain roughly 400 feet below the summit and burned. All 6 aboard were killed. The wreckage was not found until 3 days after the crash. Audie Murphy was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery on June 7, 1971. Alvin York. On September 2, 1964, Sergeant Alvin York died at the Veterans Hospital in Nashville, Tennessee, from a cerebral hemorrhage. He was 76 years old and had been confined to bed for a decade, paralyzed by strokes that began in 1948. The man who single-handedly silenced a German machine gun position in France, killed at least 25 enemy soldiers, and forced the surrender of 132 German troops, spent his final years entirely dependent on others to care for him. York had grown up in rural Tennessee, a farmhand and a marksman who tried to claim conscientious objector status when America entered the First World War. His request was denied. During the Meuse-Argonne offensive in October 1918, his patrol was pinned down by machine gun fire. York worked his way around the enemy position and began picking off gunners, one by one, with the marksmanship of a man who had spent his entire life hunting. When German soldiers charged him with bayonets, he drew his pistol and shot them in sequence. By the time it was over, he had captured more prisoners than he had men under his command. General John Pershing personally awarded him the Medal of Honor. York came home and used his fame to build a school for rural children in Tennessee. He refused most commercial offers and spent years advocating for veterans. A first stroke came in 1948. A second in 1954 left him paralyzed. He spent his last decade in a hospital bed. President Lyndon Johnson called him a symbol of American courage and sacrifice. York was buried in his hometown of Pall Mall, Tennessee, near the hills where he grew up. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for similar ones, and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments.